Hi, all. Welcome to our webinar tonight. We're going to give everybody until about 6:02 to get logged in, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks for your patience. All righty, folks. Hello and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the fourth Honoring Diversity lecture taking place this spring semester. I am Damien Clement, Associate Dean of WVU's Honors College. Tonight's lecture is entitled Applying Liberatory Leadership Theory to Leadership Practices in Academia by Dr. Amena Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an assistant professor of practice and the assistant director of WVU ADVANCE Center. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening. After the presentation, we will host an open question and answer session. Since we're using the Zoom webinar platform for this lecture, before we begin, let me review some of the features that will help you experience this evening's webinar in the best way possible. If you're having issues with audio or video at any point during the webinar, be sure to check your personal Zoom settings and your computer volume controls. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see others' questions, only their own. To ask a question, you must click on the Q&A button. A separate screen will appear. Then you may type your question. The presenter will answer all of your questions live at the end of the presentation. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. So now let's get started. It is my honor to hand the screen over to Dr. Anderson. So I'm gonna stop the share so you can.
There we go. Okay, good evening. First of all, we are in Black History Month, and I am excited to welcome those of you who are here to this conversation. I think I like to think about this as a conversation. And in honor of Black History Month, which for me, Black history is every day. And it is pertinent every day and relevant every day. And so I think, though, that there are times when we should draw attention to some of the specific accomplishments of folk from the African American and the diaspora community. So thank you so much for coming and being here. I love, this title of honoring diversity. And I think that, we honor diversity ultimately when we honor ourselves and each other and the ways in which we all add in unique ways to the fabric of our society. And so We are honoring diversity with this series and all of the wonderful colleagues of mine who are part of this series. I was asked about doing this, I think almost about last year, by a very outstanding graduate scholar here, Marla Gladstone. Marla, if you're watching, I thank you for the invitation. At that time and until now, I have been engaging with this concept of liberatory leadership. And in my role at the university, I am an assistant professor of practice. That title I found very befitting as someone who had been a higher education practitioner for a number of years, but one who, as a part of my practice, was informed by theory, and then the assistant director of the WVU ADVANCE Center, which is really an academic hub for the fusion of theory and practice. So it's a really great fit for me. Applying liberatory leadership theory to leadership practices in academia. So I was thinking a lot about that title, and a couple of people reached out like, oh, liberatory leadership theory. Well, I want to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I have a particular disposition toward theory, and for students who have taken my classes, they understand that one of the first things that I want them to be able to do is feel as if theory is accessible to them. We all have theories, and some of our theories are stronger perhaps than others. But I have a disposition toward theory that I like to share as a self-described scholar practitioner. Theory is useful to inform, but not to dictate practice. It should be carefully critiqued for its contextual salience. And more often than not, theory can and should be extended and/or adopted. So when I think about this idea of liberatory leadership, and I describe it as theory, it's really a proposition that it is a heuristic, a tool for illumination to help explain the application of liberatory principles, tenets, to processes and practices within and beyond the higher education classroom. Why would I talk about liberatory leadership as opposed to social justice leadership? Well, in essence, they're just about the same thing. I think that notions of liberation are rooted in the moral imperatives of liberation theology. It is a leadership approach or theory that is, simultaneously encompassing of spiritual, servant, and transforming leadership approaches. As we have historically in movements for social justice, we must not abandon the places where many can connect and hold each other accountable. Furthermore, semantics matter, whether or not they are always as effectual as we hope that they will be. Okay. The liberatory, I know, I think I went past. Yeah. So I want to talk with you a bit about this idea of liberatory consciousness. For the undergraduates in the room, you may or may not have ever engaged with the work of Paulo Freire. And if you're not in education, and if you are in fields that don't necessarily engage these sorts of sociological concepts, this may be new to you. For others of you, you may be very familiar with this idea of liberatory consciousness, or as Freire called it, critical consciousness. And this is essentially another way of talking about it. And we came into I came into, through a diversity in higher education course, awareness of this piece that I thought was so provocative. My career started in, my higher education career started in a diversity position. And so I brought that knowledge and experience of 7 years in that role to the work that I do now, and into my doctoral studies. And so when I first encountered Love's definition of liberatory consciousness, it really resonated with me. And so I'll share with you what she says here about liberatory consciousness. A liberatory consciousness enables humans to live their lives in oppressive systems and institutions with awareness and intentionality, rather than on the basis of the socialization to which they have been subjected. A liberatory consciousness enables humans to maintain an awareness of the dynamics of oppression, characterizing society without giving into despair and hopelessness about that condition, to maintain an awareness of the role played by each individual in the maintenance of the system without blaming them for the roles they play, and at the same time practice intentionality about changing the systems of oppression. A liberatory consciousness enables humans to live outside the patterns of thought and behavior learned through the socialization process that helps to perpetuate oppressive systems. So that's a lot to take in, but this thinking, this mindset, this idea of liberatory consciousness is one that I came to embrace personally, but also professionally and in my practice as a faculty member and as a scholar practitioner within academia in a classroom and also outside of it. A liberatory predisposition and sense of duty. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit because the subject of leadership is really one that is often contested. And when I say that, there are some communities, academic communities, that don't necessarily like the idea of leadership in terms of the way that we think of it in traditional terms. One of the things that I have enjoyed doing in my classes is really inviting my students, before we even open the textbook, to share and come up with, in small groups, a theory of leadership. And ultimately, there are various theories that they come up with surrounding ideas around leadership. One of the most profound, or I won't say profound, one of the most used theories of leadership in a traditional sense is offered by Peter Northouse, who is the author of Leadership and Theory. Theory and Practice, Leadership Theory and Practice. And it's a fairly, what I would call, traditional. It talks about essentially 4 components of leadership that are pertinent and characterize how we think about leadership. And so it talks about leadership being essentially a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So, if we think about this use of that definition of leadership, it would apply in terms of thinking through a potential theory of liberatory leadership. What I'm proposing here is that liberatory consciousness develops what we call a liberatory predisposition that causes one to think in liberatory ways in both their personal and professional lives. Liberatory consciousness essentially decenters without disposing of oneself and self-interest. Instead, it elevates the significance of oneself as part of the whole, as connected to and interdependent with all of humanity. It inspires an innate responsibility or an internally driven sense of duty to contribute to the liberation of all. So if you think about having a liberatory disposition, which comes from this idea of a developed liberatory consciousness, and then an internally driven sense of duty, it makes sense then that this sort of individual would naturally engage in what we would call liberatory leadership as a practice. So in thinking through and looking for others who have been thinking about liberatory leadership, I came across this phenomenal group, the Liberatory Leadership Partnership, and I really appreciated the way in which they defined liberatory leadership theory and practice, they talk about it as inviting us to lead from a place of love. In academia, we don't necessarily think about love as something that would be a tool for us to utilize, but here is an interesting way of thinking about how love works, and we can unpack what that is. And then wholeness and interdependence. By valuing celebration over competition, these concepts, in very many ways, push against traditional notions of how the academy functions. Competition is one of the defining features of academic life. But what if we were to value celebration and collaboration over competition? It talks about being able to access possibilities that can only emerge through community. The practice of liberatory leadership flourishes when we create space for rest, when we address power differentials in service of justice, and we center those at the margins within our organizations and our work. So, oh, yeah, you can see me. Okay, so what I've done here is pulled out, you see, can you see the top of the screen? The Change Agent course, which is a course that I co-developed with other colleagues in 2017. And I pull it out as an application of liberatory leadership. And in our most recent book, which I will make a shameless plug for here, and I think I have the information on it on the next slide. Our book is Engaging Faculty in Group Level Change for Institutional Transformation. Within that book, we have a chapter titled The Academic Change Agent Course, a Transforming Initiative, that is authored by myself and my good colleague, Chris Kunkel from the Communication Studies Department. But what I'm sharing with you here is the course as a way of applying this liberatory leadership theory. So we've grounded the course around Barbara Love's liberatory consciousness. And in it, she talks about awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. These are obviously not linear. And here you see how we depict them in our model here as being bidirectional. So awareness of what we would call social justice problems or problems of inequity, having that level of awareness of it. So oftentimes social justice movements or equity movements are really focused and talk a lot about awareness. But what I love about Love's work is that she moves us from just a initial engagement with the idea of awareness. There are a lot of us who believe, or our institutions and organizations believe, that somehow you go from awareness to people acting in the interest of liberation or social justice. And in fact, that is not at all how it works. There are lots of things that we have awareness about. Some of us can attest to being really aware about the importance of recycling, for example, and just being aware that there is a problem, that that problem has particular implications, does not cause us to leap to action necessarily. So in this process of developing a liberatory consciousness, we think about awareness as our engagement and analysis with the problems that surround us, right? And so in the course, we actually look for people to enroll in the course who are not at a very fundamental level challenging the idea that there are, in fact, justice and equity problems. If there are people who are in denial of justice and equity problems, that's a different kind of a workshop to help illuminate for them how these problems exist. But for academics who are faculty and also administrators, we begin and seek out individuals who are essentially at the point of saying, I am aware that there are problems. I may not fully understand what contributes to these problems, but I want to be a part of those solutions, and I want to engage in an analysis that leads us to the kinds of solutions that we're looking for. So we move from awareness to analysis, and as I say that, you could see how sometimes in our analysis, it would take us back to awareness. And then from analysis for the purpose of identifying viable solutions to the problems that we seek to solve. So here you see awareness, analysis, action. And in our framing of this, and what we've learned from our practice is that accountability essentially encompasses this process, right? We go back and forth from an awareness to analysis, from analysis to action, from action to accountability. And accountability is a notion that Barbara Love talks about it in terms of accountability and allyship. That is a commitment to act. But it happens within the context of change agent community. And when we say change agent community, we're essentially talking about a collective of people, in our context, academics, who are committed to efforts towards social justice and transformation. But we also talk about accountability outside of change agent community, right? And so we'll get to this a little bit more because I'm going to give you some more, I'm going to put up another slide on the course itself. One of the things that you see here is the outermost circle is something, I know I talked earlier when I mentioned theory and my disposition toward it. Theory, it can be useful to inform how and what we do, but it is also provides an opportunity for us to expand it or adapt it. In our practice of the application of the course and other of our initiatives that seek after equity, we realized that sustainability had to be a part of this overall conceptual framework for the course. So how do we sustain our involvement? And by sustaining the involvement, the requirement of community, as we interacted with change agents who have taken the course since 2018 up until this past spring, one of the things that emerged from their engagement was this idea of change agent identity. I've been in community with other people, other academics who share my values, who share my commitment to doing this work. And that helps to really concretize this sort of commitment to the course. So it becomes a supportive framework for the course. So this idea of liberatory consciousness and which leads to this liberatory predisposition that leads to a liberatory predisposition that it then informs liberatory leadership within a context of organization. The goal is that it would lead to these liberatory outcomes. So in looking at this application of liberatory leadership, we want to use the course as an example. And one of the things that I want to do here is I'm going to pull up a different slide. Had some trouble transferring slides over. That helps you to get an idea of what the course essentially does. So thinking about this course as an application of a liberatory leadership. So the change agent course is an effort to develop liberatory leaders and also an application, a good example of an application of liberatory leadership. So we have the learning outcomes from the course. Course completers will have an increased capacity to describe and operationalize frameworks for developing liberatory consciousness, outline the ways in which liberatory processes of problem analysis differ from traditional processes of problem analysis, and thus increase the likelihood of equity and justice outcomes, apply the tools of deconstruction and the tools of reconstruction to sense and decision-making processes within their spheres of influence and at the university and beyond, identify, adopt, and support liberatory leadership frameworks that de-emphasize the centrality of a single leader and instead center collaborative leadership practices that are hierarchy attenuating. So I talked about the conceptual framework, and it's being rooted in Barbara Love's work, problem awareness, seeing and questioning the status quo. Here we also engage with this idea of equity consciousness, developing equity consciousness, internal and external awareness of systemic oppression and its effects and commitment, the will to take up equity challenges. So this is all part of what we cover when we deal with this particular module of the course: problem analysis, problem framing, and problem reframing with liberatory consciousness. So one of the activities that we do in the course is literally a case that centers around making a hire. And so in that process, we invite people to think about what they might normally do, and then applying liberatory frames, which I'll talk more about, what they could do differently to promote liberatory outcomes. So the complexity, understanding the nature of complex systems, distinguishing between complex versus simple or complicated problems, and developing corresponding leadership approaches that match the actual complexity of equity challenges. Problem action, problem-solving action, action assessment, what's been done, what's worked and hasn't worked, what's not being done, could work, low risk to vulnerable populations, individual and collective agency, proximity, and leveraging power and privilege. Also, we talk about, approaching equity challenges through the mindset of user-centered design, which shifts traditional power dynamics related to decision-making and brings forth deeper innovation and agency amidst institutional norms and structures. And then accountability. So we get to this module, reflecting and redirecting accountability plan, right? These LFE is Leadership for Equity, which is a pre-existing approach to leadership design. So in the framework of leadership design, there is the proposition to notice and reflect. So practice self-awareness, consider context and explore history, reflect on team health, design intentions, design processes, impact individually, interpersonally, institutionally, and systemically. And then, as I talked about in our text, we discuss how we have included this idea of sustainability as part of the framework, creating a sustaining change agent community and coalition, institutionalizing social justice capacity as a high value criterion in faculty and administrative hiring, for example. And then developing liberatory and resilient systems. Often the goal of equity work is framed as closing achievement and/or closing achievement gaps and/or opportunity gaps. Here we emphasize the goal of developing certain system conditions that increase their capacity to bring about more equitable outcomes and experiences. Okay, so let me make sure everyone can see this. Okay, so one of the things that we do in the course, and we separate the course into 5 different course modules, essentially. And the first 2 classes focus on problem awareness and problem analysis. And one of the tools that we use, or the primary tool that we use for these 2 classes are the tools of deconstruction. James P. Dugan, excuse me, not James, John P. Dugan is a critical leadership scholar, and he has proposed the application of the tools of deconstruction. And here in class 1, when we talk about problem awareness, we spend time on positionality and perspective. That is really helping our course participants to think deeply about how they are situated in the world, but specifically within the context of our organization. So when we talk about positionality, some of you are very aware of what that is. We're talking not only about understanding the multiple social identities that we each have. Those identities may be either marginalized or they may be dominant identities in this society. If they're marginalized, it may be, what we call minoritized racial or ethnic groups. If they are majoritized identities or dominant identities, we might be talking about white men, heterosexual, for example, as dominant identities. But in addition to understanding one's social identities, it's also an understanding of one's proximity to power, right? And so your positionality and your perspective, and your perspective is often informed by your positionality, has to do with your capacity to see inequity. So that if you have marginalized identities, your capacity to see inequities is going to be probably heightened, normally heightened. If you have majoritized identities, primarily dominant group identities, you may have a more difficult time in the awareness process recognizing systems of oppression. So another tool of deconstruction is ideological critique. So questioning the system, right? So once you see what we claim to be a system of oppression, now critiquing it, looking at the patterns or the products that it produces, right? And so that's another process that we engage our students in the course. Heightening awareness, sharing information. So in the problem awareness process, there is not only the responsibility to heighten one's own awareness, but also share information that heightens the awareness of others. In the second class, we move to problem analysis using the tools of deconstruction. And so one of the implicit leadership theory is really something I kind of alluded to earlier, is essentially sort of what we think leadership is. What is sort of our implicit definition? It is the definition the students were giving me when I asked them to come up with their own leadership theories. Well, leaders are very trustworthy, they're well-spoken, they are very organized, they're very inspiring, whatever those implicit beliefs are about leadership, that becomes a part of the analysis. So first, understanding whether or not you think someone is a leader may have everything to do with your implicit definition of leadership. Other tools of deconstruction include how power flows, observing, being aware of how power flows in organizations, right? So when you come into a given setting, and for us, those of us who are in academia, we pay a lot of attention to who the hierarchies, who is really important, who is not. Now, sometimes there are formal ways in which this works, the flow of power by position. But sometimes the flow of power may be informal, right? It could be the right people, who they're connected to, the kind of influence they have, the length of time they've been in a particular space. So as part of problem analysis, you're going to pay attention to the flow of power and understanding the flow of power. Another tool of deconstruction is willful blindness, thinking about what are we actually willfully blind about, right? Now, as I say that, I want to make a nod to a recent article that my colleague and I, when we taught this, came across that really challenged this idea of using terms like blindness as being not knowing or uninformed because of its implications for people without sight. So I want to acknowledge that. Then commodification, prioritizing productivity over people. I mean, essentially, this is the conversation that has to do with this underlying purpose of leadership and organizations and the different approaches, and whether or not a given approach is more concerned with the outcomes, the productivity, and in particular settings, the making money over people, right? So looking at how an organization functions, the decisions that are made, the way sense-making occurs, and whether or not it is more productivity oriented or people oriented, is an important process in the use of the tools of deconstruction. Okay. And here, this is really just another sort of depiction of these terms. So ideological critique provides a definition. The critique is always of the status quo, the norm, the flow of power, questions in the distribution of power. I went over that. Questions of, maximizing productivity that can result in dehumanization, and the diminishing of knowledge, questions of how and why people remain purposely unaware. So I covered those, and that slide does that for us. This is actually the article that my colleague brought up to me as we were working on this. And one of the things that we do in our practices, as we are carrying out any of the initiatives, our dialogues initiative, which very many of the faculty and administrators have participated in, that Advance does, or the change agent course, we learn as we go along, and we are comfortable with the idea that we don't always have to be right, that actually in doing the work, you get more clarity about the work. And so this is the article that she came across at the time when I was telling her about the use of willful blindness, and then another idea of blind spots, right, that we talk a lot about. So I wanted to show you how we sort of acknowledge and discuss this within the context of the course, to acknowledge how this sort of learning is ongoing. Now, I don't know why this isn't advancing. Okay. So in the third class, we focus on problem-solving action, right, using the tools of what Dugan calls reconstruction. So we talked about the tools of deconstruction. So if you envision having a building and taking that building apart, perhaps those who have background in building homes or buildings, whatever it is, if you find a particular flaw, sometimes you have to deconstruct the whole thing, right? And so in taking that apart, if you just envision that, and then this idea of how you put it, how you reconstruct something, to make it better, different from what it was before, but far more effective. So these tools of reconstruction are offered to us by Dugan. Again, and we use them to ground the work that we carry out during the course. So in our third class, we focus on problem-solving action, and we engage these tools. We also have come to embrace this liberatory design mindsets and modes. And so in the tools of reconstruction, we look at disrupting normativity. So when we were talking about the tools of deconstruction, we were recognizing what the status quo is, what people really believe to be true, being aware of how these particular norms are informing particular outcomes. And then we talk about how do we attend to the power. So now that we are aware of the fact that power flows in a very particular way within the context of our organizations, what can academics, what can faculty, what can administrators, and this semester I'll be teaching a phenomenal group of graduate students, what can they do to attend to the power that is there? How do we analyze our own spheres of influence to determine how we can attend to power in ways that neutralize it and in ways that amplify the voices of those who may be silenced or those who may be the most disenfranchised? And so in attending to power, we think about the power differentials. One of the things that we do, that we came to do when we started the course, and this is another example of lessons learned, is we would determine that we're just going to introduce people. We're not going to ask people to say your title and all of that, because we felt that that would create an atmosphere where people might feel somewhat intimidated to talk about those things. And we thought that was a really great idea, but as you practice, you learn and do better. I came across some research that really talked about how not being clear about who's in the room, about how power is dispersed in particular rooms, can really disadvantage the least powerful, right? So the least powerful, if we invite them into what we call a safe space or a courageous space, and we invite them to engage, and all they've heard are the names of people around the room, and they don't know what positions they hold, some of whom are very powerful people at the university, there may be things that they don't necessarily want to say in the presence of a dean or in the presence of a chair or a vice president. So we had to revisit how we respond to this attending to power. And so rather than remove it, we use this example to show how complex it could be. There's not always a right or wrong answer. The other idea, the other tool of reconstruction that we talk about is cultivating agency, which is really not only acknowledging one's individual agency, but how are we able to, and particularly people who have quite a bit of power and privilege, how can we increase the agency of others? How can we as leaders encourage those who may be at the so-called lower tier of the organization to feel empowered to derive the benefit that their expertise brings? So that is another tool of reconstruction. This building interest convergence, another tool, is really derived from critical race theory. And it is an idea that Derek Bell, the great scholar, legal scholar, talked about, that, building interest conversion, when we talk about doing the work for social justice, we think that people will always be moved by good intention. Well, that's nice, but that's not typically what happens. In order for sometimes organizations, institutions to move in the interest of social justice, we have to find where interests converge. So yes, we want to accomplish this particular thing, and here's how it will benefit your goals in terms of, for example, I'm reminded when I was doing my dissertation research, the NSF said that it values diversity because of the innovation, and that innovation it has everything to do with our capacity to be competitive at the global level, right? And that also turns into, for institutions, our capacity to bring in diverse scholars. And if we're bringing them into our communities need to, in fact, honor diversity and be a place where they can thrive. And in return, the interest is the value that they bring in terms of their contributions to the academic community. Liberatory design mindsets and modes is really interesting. You can look that up. We really embraced it as a tool to use in the classroom to help people think about the kinds of mindsets that enable you to engage in liberatory practice. And for very many of us who design programs, that would include the development of particular kinds of programs, practices, services, and then the modes. And rather than spend a lot of time on those, I'll invite you to look at those, and I have references for those who are interested. Okay, and this, again, is a slide that sort of breaks down what I've shared with you about the tools of reconstruction. And then this idea of accountability, right?
Hey, Amina,
Yes.
the slide we're seeing is just a presentation reference slide. So I
Oh,
don't know if that's the slide. I
this
don't
slide,
think that's
what does it say?
presentation references. It looks like it's the second to last slide of that.
Have you never seen all the other slides I've been working through?
We saw some, but I think we've been on this reference slide here
Oh, geez.
for a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, oh, geez. Okay, well, give me 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to reshare it. I don't know how that happened, Damien.
It's all right.
Okay, so do you
All
see
right.
something different now?
Yes, WVU ADVANCE Center,
Had you
Choose
never
Regions
seen this
course.
before? I've been working through all these slides. Did you not see?
No, I
Oh,
know.
wow. Okay.
But
My apologies. I'm just clicking through the slides, and I'm not sure why you all couldn't see them, but that just will run you through these, okay? They encompass all of what I've been running my mouth about here. I don't know how that happened, but my apologies to the audience. Okay. Okay. Maybe some of the questions will prompt me to go back to slides because people ask about that. Okay, so I want to wrap up because I know we're right at 6:45. Accountability is what we broach in our final class, and this is around taking social justice action, practicing accountability, which means that in terms of being an ally, a co-conspirator, abolitionist, the multiple terms that we use to talk about how one engages in social justice action, there is a need for accountability. And so the practice of accountability requires the willingness, the vulnerability to be wrong, and to learn how to stand in one's wrongness and to receive constructive feedback about initiatives that you may have as an agent of change initiated to make a difference, but subsequently found out that it actually didn't make the difference that you wanted it to make. And so if you are connected to a change agent community, you're able to get that feedback from those who you trust, who are also committed to this work. So what I'll do here is move to this final slide, slide 5, sustainability. And here, we talk about the development of a system and conditions that increase capacity to bring about more equitable outcomes and experiences through growing coalitions of change agent community, institutionalizing social justice leadership, or what I've come to call liberatory leadership capacity, as a high value criterion, and then connecting and community again. So those are, I am so sorry that you all were not able to see that. And then, of course, this past year, we've created a WVU Advanced Change Agent Badge, and those are their criteria outlined. Let me stop sharing for a minute here, and I'll put back up the previous. I don't know how that happened, but we'll go back up here. So I know we're right at the time that you wanted to be able to entertain questions, Damien. So let me allow you to do that. And maybe it'll bring me back and I can show some of the slides you all couldn't see. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
I was muted and I did not unmute myself. So, but thank you very much for the presentation. I know at times we weren't able to see what it is you were talking about, but we were able to hear and I was able to follow. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. We have the Q&A that's up and active. What questions would we have for Dr. Anderson based upon her presentation? See what we got here.
Should I stop sharing to see the Q&A or?
I can see you. No, I don't think
Okay.
you're not sharing right now. You are totally live. I can see you. I guess we have still not seen any questions. So I mean, well, just to kind of get us started off here, can you give us a short, I guess, okay. I see a question here. This work is so important, especially in today's climate. How do you see this work going on?
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good question. So one of the things that we did for this past class, we looked at some, and we're simultaneously working on a paper that outlines some indicators of the application of liberatory leadership in practice. And so in this particular climate, it's interesting because the question arises of how do you do, what does this look like in a climate that can be hostile toward things like DEI or the idea of liberatory leadership? How does one regroup and focus? And so interestingly enough, I think perhaps one of the reasons why I find liberatory leadership so helpful is because of its attention to wholeness and the attention to love and being well. And so in times like this, it's important to build community with people who share your same values, our same values as change agents, and be planning how we pivot. What does the pivot look like? And one of the reflections from a change agent course participant, they talked about the utilization of the tools of reconstruction and deconstruction in a recent hiring process. And so their opportunity there was to think about, this is how we always do this, but what happens if we decide to not provide identifying information to any of the folk who are a part of this hire. And this was actually in a administrative leadership position, and allow people to sort of rank based on that, and then provide some questions around how people came to make the decisions that they did. That was actually a direct response to an activity that we had done in a class that allowed us to analyze a case, do some sense making and decision making, and then go back and challenge our definitions or our assumptions about people who graduate from certain institutions, have certain kinds of experiences. So it really allow people to sort of unpack some of the things that don't come out. In this climate, too, another member of our class talked about how, in their reflection, talked about how this particular climate requires them to be more tapped into the specific needs of certain communities that they're trying to reach out to, the need to be far more authentic and to convey that. I mean, they may be authentic, but how do we convey that in ways that are attentive to folks' interests? In this particular moment, one of the things we're working on now is a mental health presentation for the Faculty Justice Network, but a conversation around the importance of us maintaining our mental health, taking stock, understanding that in a system, we're not unique as WVU, in a system that has a bend towards commodification, how do we preserve essentially our awareness that our life, our families are really the most important thing, and sort of create opportunities for gathering and reflection and support. So there are a number of ways I can talk about things that aren't necessarily in this context, that are applications we find of liberatory leadership by administrators, deans, chairs. But that, in this particular context, is something that we're trying to find constructive ways, and people who've done the class are finding constructive ways to still fortify change agent community, even if some of the actions we would normally take are not ones we can necessarily take in this time, right?
Okay, let's answer. There's two questions that are tied around the same thing.
Okay.
Could you repeat the name of the class and how is this class/course received?
The name of the course is the Change Agent course. That's the current name of the course, is the Advanced Change Agent course. Its original name was Developing Liberatory Consciousness for Transformative Action. And the switch in name of the course was in part for pragmatic reasons, but also because sometimes certain names, certain language we've had to be responsive to in this particular climate, can be challenging for us and create unnecessary, pushback against the good work we aim to do.
And how do we get access? How do people get access to the course if they,
If you go now to the WVU ADVANCE Center and you scroll down to the information about the course, you can actually register for the course. We have a course that begins on February 16th and completes the end of May. We have a ceremony we do, it completes the end of April, but we have a ceremony that we do in May. You can register, you can get more information. We're going to offer the course again in the fall. So if you visit our website, you can actually register for the course.
Okay, here's another question here. I understand liberatory leadership on an institutional level, but how can one apply these principles on a micro level, say in leadership of a group of 8 to 16?
8 to 16 people?
Yep.
Yeah, I think you introduced the concept of it. And what I was, you know, there is and I said this earlier, there's a moral imperative to this idea of liberatory leadership, right? This idea of really a wholesome concern for the well-being of all, right? One of the scholars that I cited in my dissertation was talked about Edwards in 2006. He talks about this aspiring social aspiring ally identity development for social justice. And so he kind of talks about 3 different ways in which we think about allyship. And so for some folk, they think about it in terms of, I'm sorry about that. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second here.
Apologies. I think she'll be back really soon.
And my apologies for that. My phone has been off, but I have an iPad and apparently all of it is connected. And so I couldn't figure out, I had to go throw that thing. And that's my phone ring. I forgot, I apologize. But to the point of working with small groups of people, it's really thinking about our interconnectedness, our interdependence, right? And I like this idea of embracing liberatory consciousness, developing it, and it connects us to the whole. And I think I said earlier that it really decenters my importance as an individual, which doesn't dispose of my importance of an individual as an individual, but it connects me to others, right? It helps me to see how I fit into the larger whole. So when you connect with groups that you might organize who are interested in really thinking about how do we develop this sense of self, and then how do we, second, this is so crazy. Sorry about that. I'm sorry about this. Damien, can you still see me?
Yes, I can see
I
you.
apologize for this.
It's fine.
I will
okay.
just say that this is probably my daughter, and I don't know how to control this, but in any case, yeah, first of all, you can coalesce around identity. So if you adhere to these tenets, if they appeal to you, you can coalesce around that and then think about the particular ways in which the actions that you all take, whatever you're organizing around, how you want those actions to be informed, right? How can they, not how can they be informed by the tenets of liberatory practice, right? And the tenets of liberatory consciousness.
Okay, we got a couple more questions here. You talked about people over profits. Can you share a bit about sustainability of that model, knowing that without profit, companies or organizations won't exist if they don't essentially make money, since we function in a capitalist system?
Yeah, that's an excellent, that is an excellent question. And let me say this, because I'm a pragmatist, I can tell you that raising awareness about a particular approach or a particular initiative that is primarily focused on product just does that. It raises awareness about it. There's often little that you can do to really reduce particular approaches unless you are positioned within an organization as a decision maker who can sort of mitigate the extent to which your organization puts profit or productivity over people. Now, what is the purpose of helping people to understand how co-modification is working within, let's just say, our own system of academia? It helps you to get a clearer view of why things are the way that they are, so that if you individually, or if individuals within the context of an institution in collectives are being affected, this understanding of how co-modification works at least informs your consciousness that it's not about you necessarily. It's not about the fact that you didn't measure up. It's not about the fact that you weren't capable or competent, but it is this reality that this exists. And so one of the things that was, an initial criterion for being involved in the class was that you would be a person who wielded a certain amount of power, that your sphere of influence would matter in terms of making decisions. So at this point, at this level, it was to have the conversation and to provide ways of folk illustrating how that happens. Now, co-modification in terms of profit in a very, direct sort of a way is one thing, but there's also co-modification in terms of the way some of our structures are designed within academia. So, for example, the privilege, we have certain fields that are privileged over others because they are perceived to bring in a certain amount of money, right? And so in models like that, we will see how that plays out in terms of who's valued, who's not valued. We may look at some of the systems for us thinking about promotion and tenure and how they play out. And so that is, I wanted to be clear. What to do with this? I wanted to be clear that I'm not offering an idealistic sort of a way of thinking about this. I'm actually saying that part of what we do when we raise our awareness, or we develop liberatory consciousness, is we're actually able to sort of call out the dynamics that are happening. Now, if we can articulate what we see happening, then that's sort of a first step in being able to think about the kinds of solutions that will work. It's a first step in understanding who needs to be at the table. It helps to inform our strategy. But if we're not clear that what we are seeing is actually the result of commodification, it becomes more difficult for us to create solutions that are going to be viable for us.
Okay, Amena. Well, I got one question and we got to wrap up.
Yeah.
What is the name of your book?
Yes, let me do it again. It is, and actually, I put it on the references, but it is Engaging Faculty in Group Level Change for.
Can you raise it up a little bit? I don't.
Sorry about
Yup,
that.
there you go. Yup, there you go.
Engaging Faculty for Group Level Change for Institutional Transformation, Disrupting Inequity, and Building Inclusive Academic Departments. And if you want to learn more about our work overall, please, take a look at this book. We do have a chapter that is an open resource chapter, chapter 2. And then the chapter that I co-authored with my colleague, Chris Kunkel, is chapter 7. That provides lots of details about our thinking about the course, details sort of our thinking about its development, and then ultimately its impact. In chapter 7, we talk about, my chapter is chapter 6. In chapter 7, we talk about the emergent change agent identity, and we're able to offer some quantitative and qualitative feedback on the impact of the course.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this evening. If you have any questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Anderson. Dr. Anderson can be reached via email at amena.anderson@mail.wvu.edu. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you for spending your evening with us. And Amena, thank you so very much for the excellent presentation. Really, really, really informative. So thank you again, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.